So again, welcome. We're just about to get started. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box, rename yourself if you're a student with an asterisk in front of your name. And I think that's all my announcements for you. So I will, oh, we got a few more people in the waiting room. So I'll give it one more minute before we officially introduce our speaker and moderators for this evening. All right. Again, welcome everyone. My name is Erin Hancock. I am with the WSCF and my pronouns are she or they. And I'm calling in from Charlotte, North Carolina, which is occupied Lumbee land. And I encourage you to also introduce yourselves in the chat box with your name, your school affiliation, pronouns, and where you're calling from and your land acknowledgement as well. And just a reminder, we are recording, so we would love to see your faces, but also feel free to turn off your video if you are not comfortable with being recorded. All right. So I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker for this evening and our co-moderators. So tonight we have Pastor Jin S. Kim, who is the pastor of All Nations and the founder of the Underground Seminary. And I'll share a little bit more information about Jen. He is, in addition to being the pastor of All Nations and the founder of Underground Seminary in Minneapolis, he grew up in the Deep South after immigrating from Korea with his family at the age of 7. He went to Georgia Tech, Princeton Seminary, has a demon from Columbia Seminary, and has served as a congregational pastor since 1993. Exasperated by the arduous task of deprogramming seminary grads in CAN's internship program, Jen thought that it would be better to equip them to be radical disciples from the start. He says, "We're trained by seminaries to help people cope with empire rather than prepare them for an alternative way of life that is counter-imperial witness to our faith in Jesus. I see emerging generations wanting to help navigating a dehumanizing society and in building healthy and diverse Christian communities as a means of reshaping that world through prophetic resistance, engagement, and action." Jen's household includes his wife, Soon Pak, and teenagers Claire and Austin. So Jen, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I know we all really learned a lot from your video presentation and really look forward to asking you questions that came up as we were watching. And then in addition to Jen, we have our co-moderators for this evening, which are two of our student leaders. We have Jessie Floyd, who is an undergraduate student at Bard College, a Spanish major with a concentration in gender and sexuality studies. So Jessie, thank you so much for being here. And then we have Nathan Samayo. Nathan, am I saying your last name correctly?
Samayo.
Samayo.
Yeah.
Thank you. I just want to make sure I get that correct. Thank you. Who is a Master of Divinity student at Harvard Divinity School. So Nathan, thank you so much for being here to co-moderate as well. All right, so if you all want to begin typing your questions into the chat box, and Jessie and Nathan will begin sifting through them and we'll get our conversation started. So again, thank you so much for being here.
Great. Thank you everyone for being here, and thank you, Erin, for the introduction. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation. I'm sure, like you all, have a lot of questions for Pastor Jin. I also do. I just want to start off acknowledging it is International Women's Day, which I'm sure many women have mixed feelings about, as I do, or maybe not, which would be interesting as well. That is a segue. But I was really interested in the portion of your video in which you talked about Adam and Eve and that story, which has been so interesting in founding some unfortunate misogyny in Christian teaching. And you talked about that a little differently. So I'm really interested in hearing more about that. And then I want to ask specifically, is a decolonial / post-colonial reading of the Bible different from a feminist reading of the Bible? And what kind of would you say about expanding more upon that, or what a feminist reading of the Bible might look like, and how would that be different or similar?
Yes, excellent questions. I'll start with a second. And by the way, special thanks to the co-leaders here and Chaplain Allison Bowden at Princeton University, who contacted me in the first place to do this. And we've collaborated for several years together. So it's such a joy to be with her and all of you here tonight. It's a true honor. And I deeply believe in the mission of the World Student Christian Federation and have such deep prayer and hope for the emerging generations to make the world set it right from what older generations like us have done to this world. But yeah, back to the question. I think there's a lot of correlation between a feminist reading of the scripture and a post-colonial reading of scripture. I think we just, as different starting points, but when we go deeply enough, we're going to get to similar, I think, understanding. For me, post-colonial just means imagining the world before it became colonized, where instead of living constructively and naturally with the world as has been given to us, for those of us of faith who believe in God to create this world for us, that we started to accumulate and aggregate and then use force to maintain that kind of hierarchy of resource possession. And that the division between male and female, a division of classes and races, people from different backgrounds, all begins with us floating from the ground, not being directly connected to the resources that are a part of the natural world. So when we don't live naturally, drawing food from the natural world, and then our waste just being compost, then we start to live unnaturally. And to me, distrust and violence, greed, all of those things are actually unnatural to us. And we don't see that kind of behavior reflected in other primates or any other creatures in the rest of the world. So this fear of death, really, I think, is one of the primary things that got introduced sometime. So something happened with resource accumulation. Was there also a fear of death, and this inability to just flow with life and death in a natural way, like all the other creatures, has meant that we have brought deep division within humanity. And I think the story of Adam and Eve is a suspicion and division between the two primary genders that happen in line with a departure from living naturally and constructively with the world. And I believe that we can not only imagine a post-colonial existence, but like what Jesus was trying to do in his time, we need to lead a movement toward a post-colonial way of life. Now, that's very complicated when we're all so dependent on things like fossil fuels and modern electricity and the way that we get water and the grow food and the way that we handle waste treatment. It's extraordinarily complicated, but I believe that there must be a revolution of the heart where we can imagine ourselves living naturally and constructively with our ecosystem. There has to be an imagination and a commitment to that way of life first. And if we do that, then I think we can start to unravel all of the intersections of injustice that includes the way that we treat women, but also the way that we treat every other kind of, the way that we otherize all kinds of categories of human beings.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Pastor Jin. And yeah, I just want to reiterate, feel free, y'all, to drop questions, even if something pops up that Pastor Jin mentions and something comes up for you, feel free to drop those questions in the chat. One of the questions that we got was, there was a theme kind of in your seminar that says, using the tools of empire to overthrow empire just creates a new empire. So I'll say that one more time. Using the tools of empire to overthrow empire just creates a new empire. So the question that goes with that is, what are the tools or frameworks that we should use to avoid reproducing empire?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think when we're right smack dab in the middle of empire, we have to gather from whatever we have, right? like one of the tools of empire is money. And we just live in a very unfortunate circumstances where money is unavoidable. But those of us who have studied the history of money, and I would highly recommend David Graeber's book, Debt. And there are other great books out there that trace the history of money. But money is basically tied to the rise of professional militaries, right? As they went on their colonial campaigns, you could not pay them with food or with a home or with a field. And they wanted to be able to transact while they were out there because, you never know when a soldier is going to die. So military campaigns required some way of giving them pay while they were risking their lives. And then, of course, it has to do with keeping of debt, where the elites were making sure that those who owe them money, that was tracked. So writing is connected to debt, and debt is connected to money, and money is connected to the military. All of this rose about 5,000 years ago, very much lockstep with the rise of cities. And a city represents the impoverishing of the countryside to aggregate wealth and resources at a city center. So you see, like city, and that comes from the Greek civitas, right? City, civitas, civilization is all one thing. So city, money, debt, military, and then slavery are all one piece. And can you believe we think we're so modern and sophisticated, and we're still in that kind of barbaric system right now? Given that we're right in the middle of this, how do we use money for good, right? Now, if we really do a far-reaching revolution, we will not need to use money at all. We can imagine that. In fact, after the Roman Empire collapsed, people went back to bartering and trading, and also to the gift economy in many, many places throughout Europe. There was a resurgence of village life and a more humane way of life for about a couple of hundred years after the Roman Empire collapsed. So the best way for us to live is without the use of money and instruments of debt at all. But until that time, how do we use money constructively? One way is for those of us create the best approximation of village that we can in our life, is to circulate our money among ourselves. The African-American community is very instructive in that sense. Because of discrimination, they were, and redlining, and so many other structural injustice systems, they were often gathered together in these ghettos throughout the country, but they did the best they could to recirculate that money within and create all kinds of vibrant communities. Of course, a white supremacist country always figured out ways to disturb that and destroy that whenever possible. But not just the African-American community here, but Jewish communities in Europe, oppressed communities all over the world have gathered and figured out how to take some of the tools of empire and convert it, right? Or turning spears into pruning hooks, so to speak, right? So if we can't completely overthrow the tools of empire, how do we at least repurpose the tools of empire in a transitional period until all of it can be overthrown? But at our church, we are constantly helping our individual members get out of debt, for instance. And I said early in the video that we have 7 community houses. Well, since that video, we bought our 8th house right across the street from the church. So we have 8 houses, within walking distance of our church. And at least a quarter, almost a third of our congregation now lives in these community houses. And out of the 40 to 50 of us who live here, every single one of us has been helped by the community to get out of personal debt. Only one person in our 8 houses actually has any personal debt left, student debt. So yes, we count on our people to tithe and give offerings to support the work of the church. But very much the work of the church also is getting our members out of debt slavery, which then gives them freedom to do all kinds of other things, like have a different job if they want. But that requires like not just getting out of debt and getting out of the use of money, but what does it mean to radically reduce our cost of living? You know, instead of having an apartment to pay and our own vehicle and our own food preparation and all of that, what if like 8 or 9 people lived in a traditional single family home, but in a really good and lively and constructive and loving and healing way, right? What happens to our need for jobs and need for money and need for transportation, childcare? How does a couple even or a family, a typically stressed nuclear family in a suburban home, what would their life look like if they lived in a broader community where they get so much more help with food preparation and childcare and cleaning and all this other things, and the children have uncles and aunts all running around, you know, relationally, spiritually speaking. So a local church that bands together and thinks, how do we overthrow the empire, beginning with our personal life and this trusted group of people in our religious community, right? And once we start asking that question, amazing things can happen. And I believe that the Bible is such an incredibly powerful resource, and especially the work of Jesus, but throughout the Bible, of what people who can imagine a world outside of the imperial context can do if they will only have the courage to imagine.
Thank you so much for that answer. I just have a quick follow-up about sort of practical-ish activism kind of routes towards dealing with money. And I was wondering, I've seen a lot of information on social media about a strike against Amazon this week, which we all know, like the sins that that company has committed, even just since the pandemic. And I'm just wondering, like, what kind of your thoughts are about activism and redistributing the wealth and like that type of way of approaching money and imagining a new world that Jesus would have wanted us to inhabit.
Yes, I'm so glad for that. And our church, we, for instance, we supported the Black Lives Movement right at inception, 6, 7 years ago. And, you know, it was not a safe time at that time. Our sign, our Black Lives Matter sign was vandalized multiple times. We got hate emails and hate phone messages from neighbors all around. And of course, we've consistently marched with Black Lives Matter and the indigenous communities. Our church sits on historic Dakota land, stolen land. And so recognizing that really our whole life in one way is a type of repair or reparations for the benefits that we have being on the backs of Native and African-American bodies, you know, for centuries. This Thursday, our church will go on a march in St. Paul against Enbridge's Line 3. They're trying to dig right underneath the Mississippi headwaters. Just think like 38 states get their water connected to the Mississippi, what is the basin, right? And there's an oil company trying to dig right underneath where the Mississippi starts in northern Minnesota. So we believe in activism. We believe in fully participating in the political process. But you know, that a lot of that is a no, and we must say no to oppression. That is at the core of the prophetic tradition. And there must be a yes, right? And the yes is, okay, what is the alternative then? How do we live? How do we care for each other? What is our version? If we're not going to use money or we're going to repurpose money, how do we do that? If we're against debt slavery, then how do we do that? If we're against the individualism and the fracturedness of human community and our own psychology, then how must we live together so that we're recreating a constructive village in our midst? So I think, you know, our church is very committed to justice and to protest movements. Even organizing against Amazon, I think, is an important thing. But constructing something, you know, the yes to communal life, the yes to God's call to make something different in the world is, I think, critically important. And I believe that the conventional church, the conventional theological academy, conventional denominations, the conventional Western Christian institution has basically suffered from a failure of imagination to offer a really powerful alternative to the no's that we all agree on.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Pastor Jin. Yeah, and I just want to leave space if anybody, I want to invite you all, if you have a question, feel free to unmute. And we can maybe facilitate questions out loud to Pastor Jin, and we would love to kind of get that dialogue going. So would anyone like to unmute and ask a question that you have? Awesome. I see Joseph, you unmuted. Yeah, feel free to ask your question. Oh, awesome. I don't think we can hear you, Joseph. Uh-oh. Okay, cool. So Joseph, feel free to, oh, I think we can hear you now, or was that somebody else? Okay, cool. Sorry about that, Joseph. Feel free to type it in the chat, or we'll come back to you after the next person. Does that sound good? Okay, great. Awesome. Any one of y'all have any questions for Pastor Jin? Awesome. Okay, cool. So we'll leave more space for questions afterwards. We did get one more question in. This is a really good one. I think a lot of folks kind of across any different kind of conversations around justice are kind of wondering this as well. It's around why decolonize and not just reject. So the question says something like, the Bible has many problematic parts. Why follow Christianity and the Bible still? Are we trying to reconcile something that is irreconcilable?
Mm-hmm. Well, whoever said that is very smart. And I mean, it's a very true and valid critique. And I fight with the Bible myself. I mean, it is just a fact that the way that the Bible has been employed over the centuries has done deep, deep damage to humanity. It is the basis for so many wars, so much hatred. And we just have to admit that. But I think one of the reasons why the Bible has been, in actuality, such a font of violence is because of the misunderstanding of what this ancient Jewish text is about. It is basically an argument among the Jewish people about God and about community and about the purpose of life. It's an argument that they have made available to themselves to inform who they are. Each generation must decide who they are based on these argumentative texts that they've made sacred. And for those of us who are eavesdropping on this ancient internal argument, it is our privilege that a specific ethno-cultural group has made their internal dialogue available to the whole world. The Bible is not monolithic. And it's not even two sides, it's many sides. It's all kinds of different groups over thousands of years sharing their opinions, their views, their dilemmas, their breakthroughs. And each generation having to figure out what part of this great dialogue, this argument, this tradition will they draw from to figure out how to live faithfully. So I mentioned in the video that I did that there is a big tradition and a little tradition. The big tradition is basically power over, the power that the kings had, the power of emperors, the power of foreign oppressors, or your own. And the prophets, when they were speaking out on behalf of the people, when they were crying out against the injustice to regular people, especially the vulnerable, they were speaking out against the big tradition, whether it was internal to them, the internal monarchy, or external to them, the leaders of the great empires that would every once in a while come through and oppress them. The little tradition is a tradition of the village elders, the judges who might have come from shepherd stock, or they might have some background as priests, or they could just be a dresser of sycamore trees. I mean, like, the judges were just anybody that the village felt had some wisdom and discernment and maturity and could lead on behalf of all. It was not hereditary at all. So the prophets regularly pointed, and it wasn't perfect either, but the prophets regularly pointed to the time of the judges as the ideal way for people to organize their political and economic life. And Jesus pointed to Elijah and Moses as his mentors, who were prophets. One, Elijah prophesied against internal oppression by the king of Israel. And Moses prophesied against an external oppressor, the empire of Egypt. So Jesus was prophesying in his time against internal oppressors, the temple leadership that was colluding with the Roman Empire to exploit and extort from their own people, as well as the Roman Empire proper. So I believe that Jesus reading the biblical text was landing with the little tradition. He was siding with those who were arguing for the little person, right? Those who are being oppressed. And so if Jesus can take sides with the entire Jewish biblical tradition, we can take sides too. So yes, there are texts in the Bible that talk about conquering other people and the genocide of a whole group of people. There's lots of references to discrimination based on gender or all kinds of other things. And Jesus took sides. So we also have to read the text, and we also, following the Holy Spirit, can take sides as well. And to me, that's a post-colonial reading of the Bible. We take all of the Bible seriously, and then we, for our own times, draw from the part of the Bible that allows us to overcome the force of empire, beginning in our own bodies, but eventually the world, and move toward a constructive humanity.
Thank you. And I just want to open that up again. If anyone wants to unmute and ask a question, if that's more comfortable. I don't know if Joseph, if you wanted to ask your question.
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yes, perfectly.
Yes. Thank you. My question is, Pastor Jean has said that we should say no to oppression. And we all agree that many people are in Christianity, who are in Christianity, do not really know what the scripture says about it, about, what they do not really know what the scripture requires of them or what the Lord requires of them. They say a bit of this and a bit of that. What do you say about it?
I'm sorry, could you restate the question, Joseph?
You have said that we should say no to oppression. And from where I come from, that is Africa. Many people are in Christianity and they do not really know what the Lord requires of them. They do not really understand the scripture and know what the Lord requires of them. So they end up trying a bit of this and a bit of that to just know where they are in Christianity. What do you say about it?
Well, I think that for a lot of people, and that includes, countless Christians that I know in my home country of South Korea, the Christian faith is just a type of spiritual coping from oppression. And certainly in the midst of oppression, to receive comfort, knowing that God loves us and that God is on the side of the oppressed is something that's very valuable. But if we're only concerned about coping or comfort, then basically we are damning the next generation to a whole new round of oppression. And that is just simply not God's way, nor the way that I believe God set creation in motion. So a lot of what those of us in ministry do is we care for, like, say, the people are fish. We care for the sick fish. They're not swimming well. They're bloated, or they have all kinds of diseases. But what we're not recognizing is that there is pollution coming upstream, and somebody is dumping toxins into the stream, which is making all the fish in the pond sick. So some of us need to go upstream and say, who the heck is polluting into this river that all of us are depending on? Oh, there's a corporation up there who has gotten special sweetheart deals because they siphon off a little bit of their profits to these politicians who allow all this pollution. You know, this morning we had a garbage truck come and pick up our trash. We pay for our garbage collection every week, right? We have corporations who give a little bit of money so that they don't have to pay for garbage collection. They just spew all that garbage into the air and into the water and into our soil that we use to grow food on, and into especially poor communities. So part of what it means to be a shepherd, a pastor, a theologian, is to not only care for the people who are, directly struggling with the toxins. That's triage ministry, that's important, but also to swim upstream and figure out what is going on, that so many people are being toxified, and doing something about that. And I'm afraid that one of the effects of colonization, whether of Asia or Africa or Latin America, the modern colonization by powerful Western nations in the global South, is basically to strip us of our dignity, our humanity, of our resources, of our labor, and then giving us coping methods that the Bible is just designed to cope with the effects of oppression, rather than teaching us the little tradition, the prophetic tradition, going upstream and reversing the effects of oppression.
Yes. Sorry, I have another question for Pastor Jean. What do you have to say about those people, those volunteers in the church? Are they being oppressed?
What volunteers?
Yes, volunteers. Are they being oppressed? What do you have to say about them?
What do you mean by volunteers?
For example, there are so many pastors who volunteer to work in the church, and they offer a lot of services, counseling, pastoral, and all that, and they are not paid anything by the church, for example. They are just volunteers. Because, for example, I have a list of few theologians who just graduated from School of Theology, and they just decided to volunteer themselves in different churches. What do you say about them?
I say that's terrible. But, is there any institution that's as good at exploiting people, volunteers, and all kinds of people alike than the church? We have 2,000 years practice exploiting people, especially our own. So I certainly hear your question, and say that, physician, heal thyself, that the church must be the first place we root out any forces of exploitation and oppression. But again, I just think there's not enough of us building something different. One of the reasons why, as a Presbyterian pastor, I was introduced to the WSCF because the PCUSA is a mainline denomination that is connected to the World Council of Churches. So I appreciate my Presbyterian background, and it has opened the door to wonderful ecumenical collegiality, theological exploration, and fellowship with Christians all over the world, like this call right now. And at the same time, the denominational system is a way of earning credentials and access and status and privilege and basic security, whether it's retirement or whatever it is. And so it's also very much part of our imperial system. One of the ways that we can do the innovation that we do at Church Foundations is never being afraid to taking off our denomination. Our property is kind of bound up in our denominational politics. We're not strictly Congregationalists, unfortunately. So I could get defrocked for whatever reason, I'm open to that. I'm open to not being a Presbyterian pastor, being stripped of my ordination status, which means that our local church building could be stripped, from ownership. We could go to court about it, but in any case, I just don't see my status as bound up in, as a pastor, as bound up in the credentialing of my denomination, and nor are we tied to our building. If we lost the building, we'd still be a very vibrant congregation. So just the first thing I think we have to do is renounce powers and principalities that exist in the institutional church itself. And then we will not be afraid of any powers and principalities out there. And it took me a while, I have to admit, to get to this point where I saw my calling as a shepherd of God's people, not based on any kind of institution. So it's tricky because we need accountability. We're fallible human beings. But to think that denominational systems is the only way that pastor can have accountability is truly a failure of a lack of imagination. So yes, there is oppression going on in local churches and in our judicatories and in all kinds of places. And we just also have to have the imagination to do something entirely different that still takes seriously accountability and authority and discipline, but that doesn't rely entirely on organizations and institutions that come right out of a corrupt institutional system in the first place.
Thank you, Pastor, for your wisdom. I appreciate. Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph.
Awesome. Thank you, y'all. And Joseph, thank you for your questions. It looks like we have time for 2 really juicy questions. So I'm super excited to get into these. Our friend Thomas actually asked a really good question in the chat, and I promise y'all, I asked him in a private chat if I can have him read it out loud. I'm not just gonna cold call him. So Thomas, I just wanted to invite you to ask your question out loud.
Okay. I'll just read exactly what I wrote. So is a truly little tradition localized community modeled after a pre-colonial system even possible in a large scale, in our large densely populated, ecologically stripped world? Is this vision of the village in our modern world a series of localized communities, or is this village in a practical sense referring to a larger global community?
Yes, great question. I believe that it's not designed to be done en masse. I think, yes, what you said at the very beginning of the question, localized community is what I'm talking about. But if we have many, many localized communities all over the world, it can then start to look like a very broad-based movement. But the polity and economics must match the ecosystem. If you look at a map of North America pre-European colonization, you'll see hundreds of Native American tribes. There are some big groupings, right? Like the Anishinaabe people, the Dakota people. There's some big groupings, but within those groupings, there's also all kinds of smaller clan systems. And they had all different languages and the way that they built their dwellings, the kind of food they ate, their rites and rituals and religious beliefs. And that's because the native people in North America were adapted to their ecosystem. And you didn't have much incentive to go conquer another tribe, because that you had to then adapt everything to that different ecosystem. So I believe that pre-colonial North America is an excellent example for us to follow We have to root ourselves in some place and figure out how to live constructively with the ecology of the place we are in. And then we will, become a natural part and a constructive part of the ecosystem. And also this sense that the best kind of earth is, earth left alone is a fantasy. People now recognize that the Amazon has been harvested by indigenous people there. They created that Eden, basically, right? And North America has always had controlled burns. The native people managed the land in a constructive way and made it even more bountiful for all the creatures, including themselves. So we human beings have a very important role in the ecological health and restoration and vitality of planet Earth. But we're not going to be able to do it if we try to do the whole world at one time. We've got to find a place, find a community, apologize to the people, because unless any of us on this call are descended from indigenous people in North America, we're all colonizers or enslaved in this place, against our will. And so we make an offering to the land and to the people that are still here, and apologize and thank the people that allow us to be here, the true inheritors of this land, the true stewards of this land. And then we love this land out of humility and gratitude. And then we figure out how to root ourselves deeply. This goes also against the penchant for specialization, and then specialization leading us to some job, right? So even those of us who consider ourselves radical will go to school here at some city, then go thousands of miles for a job over there, then an internship here. And if we ourselves are floating from the land and not engaging and investing constructively, making ourselves part of the earth, our Mother Earth and Father Sky, then what does it mean to be radical? I mean, the word radical means radish, meaning under the ground, right? If we ourselves are floating with late stage Western capitalism. And I know, WSCF has a lot of young people. It's not just for young people, of course, but it does have the word student in there. And so we're trying to figure out what to do, and no place really feels like home. I mean, just think about what place in America doesn't have a McDonald's. Every little town looks the same as every other little town now, which is very unfortunate. And so some of us just have to go somewhere and make it stick and create a community and see if other people will rally around that vision and do something other than what McDonald's and Amazon and other corporations like this have done around the world.
Thank you. I love the radish. That's really an image that stayed with me.
Well, Korean people do love kimchi, and so the radish is our national food.
That's so perfect.
Radical in that way.
I love that. I love that so much. So we have time for, I think, one more question, and there's more questions now in the chat too. So maybe some follow-up might be necessary. But I just wanted to highlight two questions, which I think we only have one, Jennifer. So I think it's from the same person. So first, Jennifer mentioned earlier on the focus on fossil fuels and like not using fossil fuels, and the church's attempt at that and sort of giving an alternative to fossil fuels. And I just want to jump in the next question so you can think of both of them at once for our last question. Jennifer mentions looking at the current theological structures within most church institutions in Kenya, it's quite a challenge for women to be entrusted with leadership roles. Looking at the patriarchal implication on scriptural post-colonial interpretations, is there a possibility that scriptural decolonization has a relationship with, this is so hard for me to say, depatriarchalization, lack of patriarchy? You know
Yes.
what that word means.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, wonderful. And we have Kenyans in our church, and it's one of my favorite countries to visit. I think that do we need to depatriarchalize our society? Absolutely. But the thing is, there's such a thing as constructive patriarchy. Now, this is going to sound really scandalous to a group like this, right? Because there's such a thing as constructive matriarchy, right? There can only be right patriarchy when there is right matriarchy. And that is to say that when we have a right relationship with Mother Earth, then we also see that Father Sky is a part of the package. We get the sun and the rain from Father Sky, and we have the verdant soil and the streams, and all of the creatures that are our companions here through Mother Earth. So when we neglect or abuse Mother Earth, then Father Sky becomes abusive, and the patriarchy turns into toxic masculinity. I truly believe that if we would just get right with nature, that we would properly become mother and father, and every shade between, because gender is inherently fluid. So wherever we are on the spectrum, we're going to be right with ourselves, right with our neighbors, and right with the earth itself. But if we're disconnected from nature, we're going to have toxic masculinity rather than constructive patriarchy. And then you're going to have basically a rebellion on the earth. So I'm instead of like trying to wipe out maleness because it has been so oppressive to femaleness, I believe that if we will restore the feminine, the female spirit, the feminine spirit to its honored place as the most elemental force of life in the universe, then those of us who are male can properly be male in context, right? But for some of us from an East Asian context, the feminine spirit is considered more powerful and more sacred. So that's in the restoration and the honoring of the feminine spirit. Those of us who have some patriarchal role can also be a patriarch in the right way, but there can be no proper patriarchy or maleness unless the feminine spirit is honored in full and restored as it should be from the beginning of creation.
Pastor Jen, thank you so much for your time this evening. Thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you, Jessie. Thank you, Nathan, for your fantastic co-moderation of this space. And thank you all for your questions. We are at time for this evening. I know there were questions we didn't get to answer, but I hope that this is the first of ongoing conversations. Just a few quick announcements before we part. I do want to, again, just thank you all, specifically those who are joining us from our global student Christian movements. I know I saw a few folks from SCM Kenya, SCM India. Thank you so much for joining us. I know it's like odd hours of the day and night for everyone. So special appreciation for you all for being with us in this conversation and just acknowledging the just incredible global nature of this conversation. It's so powerful. So I'm going to share a few quick announcements and then I'll let you all go to get with your evenings, mornings, whatever time of day it is for you. Alyssa Terry is going to drop an Instagram handle in the chat box. She's been working on our social media for us. We finally have it up and running and we hope that you all will join us for upcoming announcements. You can follow that if you're on Instagram. I'll also put the link to our website, which is another great place that you can look out for announcements about upcoming events we have. Just a few to go ahead and put on your radar. We have our next global prayer gathering happening on the last Monday of March, which is March 29th at 10 p.m. Eastern time. That information is on our website if you haven't already registered. And then we'll have another Progressive Christianity 101 conversation coming up in a few weeks. We'll have the information announced very soon, but that's going to be with our student Christian movement, our friends in the Philippines, speaking about some of the work that they've been involved in on the national level there, fighting the anti-terror laws that their government has put in place. So be on the lookout for that as well. Again, thank you so much for being with us tonight. You can also sign up for websites on our, it's 10 o'clock at night, 11 o'clock at night. This is what happens to my brain, but sign up for updates on our website as well. If you go to the contact us, and we can make sure you get on our mailing list, so you get emails about all of these events as well. So again, thank you all so much. Special thank you to Pastor Jen again, Jessie, Nathan. We really appreciate you all.